Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. Coming up, Chinese and Vietnamese top leaders hold talks in Beijing. China put forward a 4-point proposal on promoting peace and stability in the Middle East. And Israel and Lebanon lay out different expectations in their first direct talks in Washington. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our first story. Chinese President Xi Jinping says China and Vietnam should accelerate the alignment of development strategies and prioritize infrastructure connectivity. He made the remarks when meeting with Vietnamese President To Lam, who's on a 4-day state visit to China. President Xi also called on both sides to strengthen cooperation in emerging fields such as artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and the Internet of Things. The two leaders witnessed the signing ceremony of multiple cooperation documents. The documents cover areas including inter-party exchanges, economy, industrial and supply chain cooperation, science and technology, and people's livelihoods. For more, we're joined by Rong Ying, Chair Professor at the School of International Studies at Sichuan University. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, this visit is To Lam's first overseas trip since his re-election, and he emphasized that the Vietnamese party and state always regard the development of relations with China as a consistent policy and the top priority in his country's foreign policy. So how would you interpret Vietnam's emphasis on ties with China?
Well, it is true. I think this is a very important visit, significant visit of between China and Vietnam. And indeed, I think between the two parties and the two peoples. As we know that General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam and also the Vietnamese President To Lam, actually it's his first overseas trip after he was elected as the president. And I think it's a kind of return visit to some extent to the one paid by General Secretary of the CPC of the Central Committee and the Chinese President Xi almost exactly last year. And the significance also lies in the fact that in the last few months we have seen that the Vietnamese Party, the Communist Party of Vietnam, just concluded a very important visit, the 14th Party Congress. So we have a totally, and of course the 16th National Congress, I guess. So we have a totally, almost totally, except To Lam, a new leadership. So with the new leader, new Party Congress, new policy sort of strategies and the new, and I think the trip. So very much underscore the kind of emphasis that has been placed by Vietnamese side to the two parties, to the two nation, two countries, and the two people. Very significant indeed, and also substantial, as we have seen that so many agreements have been achieved. And this is also significant in the fact that the world and the region, the world at large in particular, have undergone so many transformations with turmoils, turbulences, and so close, frequent, high-level interactions, strategic interactions between the two parties, the two countries, would definitely help to further strengthen, deepen the relationship, and will provide, I think, a positive sort of momentum, impetus, and a strong sense of stability to the region and the world at large.
The highlights of this visit this time include cooperation in infrastructure and youth exchanges. What is the significance of that?
Yeah, that is true. I think during the visit, we have seen not only this high-level, high-profile meetings between the leadership, we have seen that many important documents, cooperation documents have been signed and overseen, actually, or witnessed by the two top leaders, and they very much focus on the infrastructure and also the use sort of exchanges. I think which the two touched upon the very basis, the foundation of a stable and strategic sort of cooperation. We all know that Vietnamese has a very ambitious, visionary, sort of strategy for cooperation. They have long-term sort of development strategy and focusing very much on a steady, high rate of growth, talking about 10% of sort of a growth rate. And for that, they need to steadily improve their infrastructure. And I think over the past few years, one would find that one of the major areas of cooperation, practical cooperation for China and Vietnam is in the infrastructure area, particularly in terms of China's investment, technologies, expertise to help Vietnam to improve the infrastructure so that they can help to support its development. So I believe this is very important area. The people, youth, as we know, they represent the future. So during the visit, over I think around 200 youth from Vietnamese youth have been invited to visit China as a kind of initiative called Red Study Tour. This is again very much important. The youth represent the future. So these two top priority areas all touch upon the very foundation of a stable, steady relationship, which I think would help to prop up the vision that's being shaped, that being formulated by the two leaders and for the two parties and for the the countries and the two people.
And upon arrival in China, Tu Lam made a visit to the Xiong'an New Area in Hebei province, neighboring Beijing. What's the importance of making that stop?
Yeah, that is again a very, I think, important part of the visit. The Vietnamese leader, General Secretary and President To Lam, he traveled to Xiong'an New Area by high-speed train. And we know that Vietnamese also have a kind of a program, a plan to build its own sort of high-speed train. So I thought this is the first and foremost would give Tong Lam a kind of first-hand personal experience of riding high-speed rail. That is very much important. But I guess the most important thing is that the Xiong'an, the city of Xiong'an, we called as kind of it's a development project with national significance. We call the city of the future. So that would also give Tong Lam and its the delegation and again first-hand sort of impression. Experience of what the Chinese mean by city of the future, which I believe that it would help Vietnamese to develop their own city development.
As you said, China and Vietnam have signed a lot of cooperation documents this time. Then how do you see the potential of the areas of cooperation between the two countries?
If one follows the sort of the documents that have been signed in recent years, particularly I think last year, the President Xi's visit to Vietnam last year, over I think 45 agreements have been signed. A lot of them touches upon, covers the practical areas of cooperation, economic cooperations, industrializations, and also emerging sectors, green transition, digital economy, and of course, science, technology, people-to-people interaction, cultural exchanges, so on and so forth. So we definitely are very much looking forward to continue this process and focusing on, I think, the areas where not only would help further implement or follow through the documents that have been signed, but most importantly, I think, touches upon how to further deepen the cooperation, so trade, investment, and also I think technological and science cooperations, and so on and so forth. So this is again very much highlights the significant the result of the visit, and definitely will continue to push the relationship to a further steady, healthy, and sort of a track for win-win cooperation.
Now, looking beyond the bilateral relationships, what do the stable and strengthened China-Vietnam relations mean for Southeast Asia, particularly within ASEAN?
Vietnam is a important country, big country. I think one of the big country in ASEAN, in the region, and it is also I think developing very fast, and with a bright future. I can see economically, and also in terms of the regional affairs, and also the role that Vietnam has been played in terms of building ASEAN sort of solidarity, bigger role in ASEAN, and so on and so forth. And for that, I think, and China is a very important partner of ASEAN, committed to working together with ASEAN to build a community of shared future. And this is again very much important. So China and us and Vietnam relationship in this context help ASEAN as a whole and the region to provide more sort of more stability, and most importantly, I think provide a kind of positive impetus for this fast-changing, turbulent world. I think this is exactly the reason why, as President Tong Lan said in his signed article published at People's Daily, that his visit, he wishes that through this visit, it would not only help two countries to have a better alignment for practical cooperation, but it also contribute positively to peace and stability, for peace and development in the region and beyond.
Thank you for your analysis. That was Rong Ying, Chair Professor at the School of International Studies at Sichuan University. This is World Today. Stay tuned.
Welcome. I am Chu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
You're listening to World Today. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. China has put forward a 4-point proposal on promoting peace and stability in the Middle East. It includes the adherence to the principle of peaceful coexistence, national sovereignty, and the international rule of law. The proposal also says development and security should be coordinated in the Middle East and Gulf region. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Beijing. Noting the stability and certainty of China-Russia relations are particularly valuable in a changing and turbulent international situation, President Xi called on the two countries to shoulder their responsibilities as major countries and permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And for China's stance on the Middle East and more, we're joined by Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Zhang.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. China's proposal stresses the adherence to the principles of peaceful coexistence, national sovereignty, and the international rule of law. What's your take on that?
Well, I think this is a very important and constructive proposal. Actually, by stressing peaceful coexistence, national sovereignty, and the international rule of law, currently China is calling for a principled, stabilizing vision for the Middle East, especially the Gulf region, at a critical moment. So from this proposal, we can see that China advocates building a common, comprehensive, and cooperative, and also sustainable security architecture where interdependent neighbors can work together rather than stay against one another. So I think in general, this approach not only upholds the dignity and territorial integrity of all countries, but also it firmly rejects any law of the jungle mentality. And the purpose is to promote dialogue, reconciliation, and mutual respect instead.
And China has also emphasized that development and security should be coordinated in the Middle East and Gulf region. What are the main obstacles to achieving that balance?
Well, I think on the emphasis that development and security should be coordinated in the Middle East and the Gulf region, this is another crucial aspect of China's proposal. In fact, I would say security is a prerequisite for development. Without a favorable and stable environment, you cannot develop your economy. This is what we can see at the moment in the Gulf region. Whereas development itself can also safeguard security. So right now, the main obstacles to achieving this balance are significant. For example, persistent conflicts, proxy tensions, sectarian problems, and external interventions. So all these elements and factors have created cycles of insecurity that can disrupt investment and economic progress in the region. So I would say if countries in the region can prioritize the economic development and increase common interests and interdependence among them, and if major world powers can refrain from interfering in internal affairs of the Middle Eastern countries, that may be very likely to help de-escalate regional conflicts.
Now, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is visiting Beijing. How would you interpret the timing and purpose of the visit?
Indeed, so Lavrov is right now visiting Beijing. I would say there are regular visits between China and Russia, just like all the other big powers. And also you can see it's not just, the exchanges between China and Russia, but many other countries. They have their leaders in China as well. So I would say Lavrov's visit right now occurs amid the Iran war's fragile ceasefire, failed Islamabad talks, and the United States blockade of the strait. So I would say against this backdrop, the major powers, including China and Russia, they are very concerned with what's going on in the Middle East and the dynamic of this conflict. So I would say the major powers, they may coordinate policies to address the current international geopolitical risks. And also, I think different powers in the world, including China and Russia, are also engaging in dialogue to reduce the spillover risks of the ongoing conflict. And it's not just about China and Russia, but many other countries are also doing the same thing.
Dr. Zhang, China and Russia have both stressed stability and international fairness. How do you see their coordination will influence developments in the Middle East?
Well, I think in this conflict, the first issue here is China and Russia are not the main players, because right now there is a conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. So therefore, these three actors are the ones who can really determine the course of this conflict. But for their parts, China and Russia, first of all, they will not play the role of adding fuel to the fire. And currently, China and Russia are attempting to promote peace talks and call on all parties to de-escalate rather than escalate the military tensions. And at the same time, China and Russia are also calling on all parties to abide by international law and rules, and to exchange their ideas through peaceful ways so as to avoid strategic miscalculations between each other.
And now the U.S. president has said the war with Iran could end soon. What do you make of that statement?
Well, actually, if we look at what Donald Trump has stated over the past month, you can see that he has many different declarations, and sometimes he can change the tones a lot. Currently, from my observation, Trump has repeatedly signaled optimism. For instance, he has mentioned, the war is very close to over. There are core strategic objectives nearing completion. And he also mentions that the United States can finish the job very fast. So even as timelines have shifted and there is a fragile 2-week ceasefire, he is still trying to send these kind of optimistic signals. And I think the reason is that this obviously fits his negotiating style, because he's trying to project strength on the one hand to pressure Iran further, and at the same time, he's also trying to keep domestic audience reassured that the conflict will not drag on indefinitely, because currently a lot of Americans, they have felt the spillover effect of this conflict, especially the inflation problem and also the increase of oil price. So that is why he's trying to reassure them. And also, I think he's trying to leave some room for a face-saving deal in the end, as long as Iran can show some flexibility. However, Trump is also preparing for the worst, because he's trying to deploying a third aircraft carrier to the Middle East. So it means that he is also preparing for possible military action should negotiations fail. Therefore, I think the negotiation between the two sides remain highly uncertain at this stage.
Trump has also indicated that the U.S. and Iran talks could resume in the coming days. How likely is any breakthroughs in this upcoming round?
Well, I would say there is low possibility for a breakthrough in the immediate round. But it's not zero. But the possibility is not very high, because right now the problem is that there are major disagreements between Iran and the United States. For example, Washington wants very feeble curbs on enrichment, on the activities, funding activities and supporting activities of Iran to its regional allies, such as Hezbollah and the Houthis. And also Washington is calling for curbs on ballistic missiles. And for its part, Tehran wants sanction relief, security guarantees, and recognition of its regional role without unconditional surrender. So I would say it's very difficult to mitigate this kind of big difference between the two sides. And furthermore, with both Iran and the United States declaring victories on the battlefield from their own countries, and neither side is willing to make significant compromises, at this stage, negotiations could potentially stall again.
Mm-hmm. And here's a follow-up question for you, Doctor, because the conflict will end one day, maybe in the shorter term or in the longer term. But if that day comes, what form of ending are you expecting?
Well, I think it's very hard to say that at this stage. But as you say, in the end, there is going to be a stop. But I would say if the conflict just continue like this, what is sure is that there is going to be very big spillover effect, and there is going to be humanitarian crisis. At this moment, we can already see that there are a lot of homeless people, and the infrastructure in Iran as well as its neighboring countries have been damaged. So I would say it will be a disaster for the whole region if this conflict does not stop at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. So far this hour, the Chinese and Vietnamese top leaders have held talks in Beijing, and China has put forward a 4-point proposal on promoting peace and stability in the Middle East. More to come in the show. Israel and Lebanon have laid out different expectations in their first direct talks in Washington, and IMF cuts 2026 global growth forecast to 3.1%. And we will bring you a conversation with a senior business consultant about the transformation of Hainan, China's pilot free trade zone. You're listening to World Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. We'll be back after a short break.
Hello, my name is Alessandro Golombiewski Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of The World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
You're listening to World Today with me, Do Hongyu, in Beijing. Israel and Lebanon have held direct talks at the ambassador level in Washington. The United States State Department says the two sides have outlined different expectations for a potential peace deal. Israel insists on the disarmament of Hezbollah. Lebanon calls for an immediate ceasefire and steps to address the worsening humanitarian situation linked to the conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. Despite the differences, all sides have agreed to begin direct negotiations at a mutually agreed time and location. The meeting marks the first major high-level engagement between the governments of Israel and Lebanon since 1993. Now joining us on the line is Tim Anderson, director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies, a Sydney-based think tank. Welcome to the show, Dr. Anderson. First of all, Israel and Lebanon have resumed high-level direct talks for the first time since 1993. So how important is this breakthrough?
Well, unfortunately, it's not really a breakthrough at all because the Lebanese government has no real leverage in this situation. They would like the Israelis to stop trying to invade their country, but they have never fired, the Lebanese army has never fired a shot in anger at any of the Israeli invasions. And that's why you have a separate Lebanese resistance led by Hezbollah in Lebanon, which the US and the Israelis are trying to get rid of now. And their main rationale for these talks is to try and get the Lebanese government to do what they can't do themselves, is disarm Hezbollah.
Several European countries, including Spain and Italy, have voiced criticism over Israel's recent airstrikes on Lebanon. How should we understand these reactions, and to what extent could they influence Israel's military actions or the broader prospects for peace negotiations?
I mean, we are seeing some more independent talk, at least from some of the European countries, as you mentioned, Spain and Italy. And in relation to the attacks on Iran too, we find France and Germany, some of the others are also dissenting now from the US. So there's some European breaking away from the US absolute commitment to the Israelis, basically, and their attacks on Iran, on Palestine, and now on Lebanon too. So it's possible that these European initiatives are going to weaken the US influence in the world, basically, and allow the possibility of some accountability on the Israelis who've been carrying out terrible crimes in the region.
Mm-hmm. And earlier, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu mentioned that they received repeated requirements and requests for starting this peace deal by the Lebanon side. So what do you think is the true purpose of the Israeli side for opening this peace talk?
The Israelis at the moment are speaking quite openly about trying to incite some sort of internal conflict in Lebanon to try and weaken the resistance, which is resisting their invasion of the south, basically. Remember, they've been occupying parts of South Syria, and they're using that to try and invade Lebanon also. They're occupying some parts of the south, but they're meeting some fierce resistance. And they haven't been able to overcome that. So they're trying to incite the current Lebanese government to act against the internal resistance on the rationale that the government should have a monopoly over armed forces, basically. And they've got some success because the current government has been particularly unpopular in trying to provoke this type of conflict with the resistance. I don't think it'll work, really. I think that's going to catalyze an internal conflict in Lebanon, more likely to lead to the resignation or the forced resignation of the government than disarming the resistance. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And then what about Lebanon? What do you think are the major demands from the Lebanon side for starting this peace talk?
Well, Lebanon has always wanted the Israelis to get out of their territory. Basically, the Israelis have invaded many, many times since the 1970s. It's only been an armed resistance that has managed to push them out in the past. And we're back to that same situation again. Of course, everyone nominally in Lebanon, all leaders nominally say that they want to get rid of the Israeli occupation, the Israeli attacks. They don't, unfortunately, have any air defense from the bombing from the air of the south or of the capital itself. And that's part of the weakness of the Lebanese state. But everyone wants the Israelis out. But the question is, who's going to oppose the Israelis when they invade again?
Now, Israel and Lebanon, these two sides have very different expectations for a future peace deal. As you said, Israel wants security and Lebanon stresses on sovereignty. So how would you assess the difficulties in reaching a future peace deal?
It's intransigent, really. The Israelis have said many times, not just that they may talk about a security zone or a buffer zone, but really they're looking at annexing large parts of Lebanon as they're looking at annexing large parts of Syria, basically. And that's very clear. This idea of a greater Israel has been spelt out officially by Israeli leaders in recent years and recent months. It's come out into the open, basically. And that's the dilemma for the Lebanese people, that they really need to unite in some way to oppose this. But the Israelis would rather try and divide them with this idea that the state should not have a separate militia, should not tolerate a separate militia in the country.
Now, if talks move forward between Israel and Lebanon, what outcomes do you expect?
I think really there's going to be a crisis for the Lebanese government. I think the Lebanese government will not be able to survive, basically. It's not possible, it's not conceivable that talks with the Israelis are going to advance this, because they are intransigent. They have their eyes set on annexing large parts of land in Lebanon and in Syria, basically, just as they have done in Palestine. And there's no possible way of seeing that there could be a negotiated settlement, basically. The Lebanese have to resist this annexation process by the Israelis, basically.
Thank you very much. That was Tim Anderson, director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies, a Sydney-based think tank. You're listening to World Today. The International Monetary Fund has downgraded its global growth forecast for this year. It cut its outlook to 3.1% from the 3.3% in its January report. The IMF has warned that beyond rising trade barriers, the Middle East conflict is threatening the global economy, with significant impacts on commodity markets, inflation expectations, and financial conditions. It also revised China's growth forecast for this year down to 4.4%. The figure is still 0.2 percentage points higher than the October forecast. For more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University.
So, Yan, first of all, what's your main takeaway from the latest World Economic Outlook of IMF?
Well, I think they paint a pretty grim picture, I would say. They talked about how, despite downside risks, the momentum initially was carried over to 2026. And, before this conflict, the Iran war, the IMF predicted or forecasted the world global growth at 3.4%. But because of the Iran war, they basically said this has halted the momentum of global growth. With the closing of the Strait of Hormuz and with the serious damage to the critical infrastructure and facilities in the Gulf region, that it's very central to the global both energy supply, but also other key supplies in the industry sector. They talk about how this Iran war is going to produce a major energy crises and supply chain disruptions, which will then derail the economic growth. So now their forecast is the baseline scenario. If the conflict is short-lived, then the growth rate will still be just 3.1%, and the headline inflation is going to rise to 4.4%, which is a sharp deviation from the previous disinflation trend.
And the IMF reference forecast, this one they are calling, it is, as you mentioned, predicted a short-lived conflict in the Middle East, yet markets are highly volatile. So how realistic do you think is this assumption, and what alternative risk scenarios should investors be preparing for if the conflict drags on?
Well, yeah, I think that, this is really a trillion-dollar question. No one knows whether this conflict is going to end soon. So I think the IMF was also very careful in terms of their, scenario forecasting. So as you mentioned, if it's a short-lived conflict, then the GDP growth will be at 3.1% and inflation at 4.4%. But if there's a longer shutdown of the strait and also further damages to the drilling and the refining facilities, that's going to create a lot more damages. In that scenario, they are forecasting the growth rate to fall down to 2.5%, and inflation rate will further rise to 5.4%. And the most severe scenario that they forecasted, where energy supply dislocation will continue to extend into next year, and inflation expectation becomes less anchored. In other words, there's more inflation expectation, and also financial conditions tighten. Then in that worst scenario, growth rate will drop further to only 2% this year and next, while inflation is going to exceed 6%. So in other words, the longer the war drags on, the more damages the war produces, then the more it is going to have serious damages to the global economy and elevate inflation.
And the IMF warned that the Middle East conflict is threatening the global economy with significant impacts on commodity markets, inflation expectations, and financial conditions. And specifically, what is this spillover effect on Southeast Asia, do you think?
Well, I think we know that Southeast Asia countries are very much reliant on the oil and energy and gas supply from the Middle East countries. And so for these countries specifically, I think they will suffer a lot from this kinds of energy crunch. So we're talking about energy shortages, but also rising costs of energy. And second, I think many Southeast Asian economies, they're manufacturing powerhouse, and they are part of the integrated global supply chain. So once the Strait of Hormuz, is closed, and some of the key ingredients for example, helium and some of the other industrial supplies for plastic and other production, if those supply chain get disrupted, then I think Southeast Asian countries are going to, again, bear a major brunt. And third, we know that, with this conflict, there's also rising prices of fertilizer because, Middle East countries are also major producers of many of these fertilizers, which are derivatives of the oil and gas industry. So with a interruption, right, of these fertilizer production, and the cost is going to rise, and that would also affect food production. So we already, hear reports, from Thailand or the Philippines that their rice production is going to be reduced due to these rising fertilizer prices. In some cases, some of the key fertilizer double the price. So overall, I think all of these will produce a quite significant damages to the Southeast Asian economies. We also know that, the exchange rates also remain volatile, and financing conditions have been, tightened. So that means it will add more financing cost to many of these countries as well. You're likely to see, rising sovereign spread on their government bonds. So overall, I think, again, the costs, right, the negative impacts are going to be quite significant for this region.
And given the energy volatility could weigh further on the global economy, do you think this will make different countries to rethink about their energy strategies?
Absolutely. I think, this war and the previous, with Russians, aggression, and also with the earlier, pandemic shocks, I think many countries start to realize that the heavy reliance on fossil fuel, especially from certain areas, certain regions, this will really expose countries to the kinds of energy shocks, and therefore become very vulnerable to the volatile, global environment. Especially now, I think, with the war that I think countries start to see, right, the post-war order is rupturing. And so I think that really pushed them to rethink about their energy strategies. So I think countries would, at least, in the medium and longer term, both diversify the energy sources. In other words, they may try to import from, many other different countries, from land, from sea, and reduce the concentration of the imports from certain countries or regions. But more importantly, I think they will try to diversify the sources of energy. In other words, boost more renewable energy compositions to substitute for these hydrocarbons. And so I think that has been, an ongoing trend, but this war is going to accelerate the kinds of transition.
And how do you see the Middle East conflict disrupting the global supply chains, and what implications could that have for growth and inflation worldwide?
Well, I think as IMF put it, right, these higher commodity prices, not only just the energy prices, but fertilizers and other industrial ingredients, all these prices will increase, and that's a textbook classic negative supply shock. And so this will then increase the cost of production, disrupt the supply chain, delay some of the productions, or even blockade some of the productions. So all of this is going to lift the headline inflation, and that's going to erode purchasing power, which means there will be demand side adjustments downwards as well. So all of this, I think, are going to slow down economic growth, especially in the cases when inflation expectation is not well anchored. In other words, when people realize that the increase in price is not going to be short-lived, then they will start to, for example, negotiate for higher wages, and that could then, lead to wage price spiral with these kinds of inflation expectation. So that's why IMF has been warning that in the short term, if price only goes up by a small amount and the inflation expectation is well anchored, then the central banks may afford to wait and see. But once the inflation expectation is elevated, then the central banker would have to tighten, their policy. Now, again, this is a classic sort of playbook by the central banks. Not necessarily that it's very effective, but the idea is that you will slow down growth further in order to tame inflation. Even though this time around, inflation has nothing to do with the demand side factors. It is more of a supply shock. And finally, I think, the tightening policies and the lack of fiscal policy support. Again, the IMF emphasized that many countries are having very small fiscal space. They don't have a lot of, the policy space. So that means, their fiscal support is going to be temporary and targeted when it comes to, price caps or energy subsidies. So, without these very effective policies, then I think the damages and the economic fallout is going to last longer. Again, not to mention, the rising financial tightening, I think that would, again, add more salt to the wound.
And for China, the IMF expects growth to moderate as global trade slows and energy prices stay volatile in the short term at least. So how do you see China's ability to not only sustain its own economic momentum, but also act as a stabilizing force for global economy?
I think, China is still relatively well positioned in this sort of energy crisis because China has, a very large reserves, energies, but it also has a very diversified source of energy. Its renewable energies are, providing a lot of energies, right, for its economy. So in that sense, I think, China is much better positioned in terms of, weather through this energy crisis. Not to mention, China has a relatively complete supply chain, and also not to mention, China has relatively low inflation for quite a few years now, and it also has ample policy rooms. There's still ways, to provide both expansionary monetary policy and also fiscal support. So all of this means that China is going to weather through the crisis relatively well.
That was Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University. Coming up, a conversation with a senior business consultant about the transformation of Hainan, China's pilot free trade zone. This is World Today. Stay tuned.
Hello, I am Dr. Digby James Wren, a political analyst and international relations scholar specializing in China area studies. World Today offers unmatched in-depth perspectives on China's politics, economics, business, technology and society. World Today's team of reporters and contributors provides valuable information from all of the world's major economies. I hope you can join me on World Today for the very best insights and news from China, on China, and help to build a better understanding of China's role in the world today.
Welcome back. A senior business consultant says free trade port policies and artificial intelligence are transforming China's southern island of Hainan from a shopping destination into a regional hub for industry and innovation. Alfred Yin, consumer sector leader at EY Greater China, made the remarks on the sidelines of the 6th China International Consumer Products Expo in Hainan. This year's expo is the first since Hainan completed its full island customs closure. More than 3,400 global brands are showcasing more products at the event. Now let's take a listen to a conversation between my colleague Gao Yingshi and Alfred Yin.
This is the first consumer expo after Hainan's full island custom closure. What's the biggest change or new trends have you observed at this year's event?
As you say, this is the first year after the full closure of the custom. We're talking about the new trends. What we can observe is a combination of the impact of the FTP policies and the technology innovation, especially powered by AI. Now, first about FTP proliferation treatment, that's about low tax, zero traffic, open first line, and control second line tax policies. Those policies are driving Hainan from a travel shopping places to a companies are now considering about manufacturing, R&D, supply chain change, regional hub to the Asia Pacific. So that drive a lot of changes here. The other thing, the evidence of that is you can see this year over 65% of the exhibits here are from international, and there's more than 3,400 global brands are doing showcases of their new products launch here. But I think the other change about AI-powered or technology-powered phenomena is also pretty clear. If you walk around here, the next door is AI glasses. The other one is robotics. So everyone is trying to combine the AI-powered technology into their consumer experiences. So the AI-powered consumer experience fully professional track the ecosystem, ESG consumptions. Those are getting more favorable and popular now in this space. So those are, and the combine of the two provide a momentum that changing the exhibit from a primary goods and shopping direction to a more deep industrialized preparation for future.
Can you give us some specific examples that stood out to you?
So the consumer coming here is not only looking for more goods. Now, what they're looking for is if the company can provide AI-powered solutions, experience, come with the good. That's also consistent with the global aesthetics of the consumer trends that more money is invested into experience consumption rather than the goods consumption. So if the company successfully introduce technology and the new experiences to customers, they're more likely to win the business.
The Chinese government has rapidly expressed that China is not only willing to be the world's factory, but also the world's marketplace. How does this shift manifest in the consumer goods sector you are observing? And what implications does this have for international brands and also Chinese enterprises alike?
First of all, I think for import goods and global brands, it's pretty clear that's about the consumer expectation level up. And they're not only looking for more goods and better goods, they are looking for technology smart, innovative products. And taking car manufacturing as a simple example, global players are already very clear. They cannot just import or manufacturing similar car models that they have been sold in globally here in this market. And they have to launch R&D center here and extract in China for China strategy so that they can innovate and produce products that meet the Chinese customers' expectation. And I think it's expressed to all the other industry too, that most companies are starting to have a in China, for China policy, and they benefit from that. In fact, I know a lot of consumer product company eventually introduce the new product and technology or customer experience engaging mechanism here back into their own markets or global markets so that the world will benefit from these trends.
Any specific examples for that?
Oh, I worked for McDonald's for quite a long time. And as you can read on news, they go through the process. McDonald's Global de-invest and reinvest in China. And in the process, they allow the China JV to innovate their menus, their customer experience, engaging on their own digital solutions to engage with customers. Eventually, they invest heavily and differently compared to global on their technology used here. After they reinvest back into China, they found that this technology are not only good for China, but also is desired by global customers. Of course, the infrastructure is a little bit different. Therefore, I believe they have numerous discussions and visits from global to learn from China market and get those things back to their own market.
And from your experience working with Chinese companies, what are the key trends you are seeing in terms of Chinese brands expanding overseas? And what unique challenges or maybe opportunities distinguish this wave from previous waves of Chinese companies going abroad?
First of all, I think most of them are thinking about going abroad now. That's true. No matter it's because super competitive domestic market or more attractive global, especially on the profit level of the global market, they're actively pursuing going abroad. But I think the fundamental change right now we can see is compared to previously where the exporter, so the my side is selling more at cheaper price and more competitive because of the price, they're now trying to become a brand story. So they're providing their foreign customers a brand story together with the ecosystem and all the value chains behind them, which means they have to be local. They have to launch for the locally, hire the local people, construct the local supply chain, not only moving the goods outside board, but understand the culture, bedding into the community, contribute to the community, have their brand image. And eventually, they need to be seen as a local partner. Just imagine, if you're selling water in the foreign market, consumer products, typical consumer products, you either tell them this is local water source or you tell them this is from Alpes spring water. You have to have a cultural and community symbol to the local market to let the consumer trust and believe is that you trust the local partner to be able to do business with them. This typically meaning more complex regulatory environments, challenges from local laws, regulations. Sometimes it extends even to the PR, GR issue that you have to be friends of the local government and people, and you will encounter different culture shockings. So this is more complex than previously you have only dealing with the distributors or they're doing business for you. But it's good. It's a whole brand exportation and brand culture ecosystem exporting. If you success, there's much more profit and benefit from that.
And how are they adapting their strategies for different international markets?
I call from a chairman from a very famous Chinese consumer product company, billion companies. They say even a good company can do right things once at a time. So you have to take baby steps, learning gradually. You have to trust the consultants, learning the local rules and regulations. It's complex. It's not easy. You make mistakes. You learn from that. But eventually, I think that every brand, consumer product, substantially, no global famous consumer product brand is a local one. It's all global. So I believe all the Chinese brands will be the same. It's just about the time consumed and effort spent. I think as a service provider that we're in a position to using our global network and knowledge consumed to helping those customers. I see them become more complex and sophisticated in planning their challenge, planning to facing their challenge. And certainly the technology, especially the AI-empowered knowledge sharing platforms and those things are helping the Chinese company to winning faster in this trend.
As Hainan Free Trade Port enters this new phase of post-custom closure, how do you view the opportunities this presents for both domestic and international consumer goods companies? And how might this reshape China's consumption landscape?
Thank you. I say again, this is the first year after the closure of the custom. If we're talking about opportunities, the enterprise will, I'm an accountant, so I know the enterprise will go to details to actually differentiate and calculate what is the opportunity means. From beginning is the tax rates, right? So the lower corporate tax rate provide more speed in return to the investment. That's clear. And the lower cap of the personal tax treatment helping to retain the talents so that they are willing to work in Ireland to do R&D and do all these things. The zero traffic policy, especially the policy if you have a value-added manufacturing here in this island, over 30%, you actually can extend that zero traffic to when you export goods to the mainland. It's a very good one. Of course, that takes a little bit of time because you have to actually reshaping your supply chain, increase R&D, increase value chain here. It takes time, it takes tailor, it takes everything. But all in all, I think the company, it's more attractive to the company after closure. And now they can have their plans and time to reshaping their supply chain to eventually enjoy those benefits, to return those tax benefits actually to the booming of the economic and increasing of the economic speed. Having said that, I think the other side of company will also take this opportunity to reshape it, because if you reinvest in supply chain and adding values in the manufacturing process, you better think about the AI and empowered and technology improvement this year to reshaping products that fit in better to the consumer needs now. So that's another opportunity, because you upgrade your supply chain, you will have chance to emerge in the latest technology into it.
That was Alfred Yin, Consumer Sector Leader at EY Greater China, speaking with my colleague Gao Yingshi. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. To listen to it again, you can download our podcast by searching for World Today. I'm Do Hu Yu in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.